The first cry of life was also the first test. In Sparta, birth was not a beginning. It was an audition. Picture it. Dawn breaking over the Taygetus mountains. The air sharp as a blade. A woman lies trembling with the violence of birth. Around her, midwives stand not as caretakers, but as agents of policy. The child slips into the world slick with blood and breath, and before the mother's heartbeat can slow, it is taken, wrapped not in comfort, but in duty. The door opens and the world closes in. If you want to hear more stories like this, about the hidden machinery behind history's myths, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. History's shadows travel farther than we think. Now, let's go to Sparta. The Council of Elders waits. Men carved from war and silence, the Gerousia, sit beneath the stone arch of judgment. The infant is stripped naked, placed on a slab. An elder lifts it toward the light, tracing its spine, testing its lungs, measuring perfection. A whimper, a twitch, a breath out of rhythm, signs of imperfection. A nod seals its fate. To most, birth is sacred. In Sparta, it was administrative. The state didn't celebrate children. It assessed them. Outside, the mother waits. She hears nothing. No cries, no footsteps returning. She knows the law. The strong are returned to their mothers. The weak are deposited. That's the word. Apothete. The deposits. The euphemism is deliberate. It turns murder into maintenance. If the baby passed inspection, it lived not as a child, but as state property. Parents were caretakers, not owners. If it failed, it was carried to Mount Taygetus. A cliff. A ritual of silence. No swords, no mercy, just exposure, cold and waiting. Modern scholars debate how common this was, but the ideology behind it is beyond dispute. Weakness had no right to exist. Strength wasn't virtue, it was permission. The mother's grief was forbidden. To cry was treason. Spartan women were praised not for tenderness, but for steel. Come back with your shield, or on it. That wasn't metaphor, it was programming. Discipline began at birth, so did dehumanization. The cruelty worked. For centuries, the system produced warriors unmatched in endurance and obedience. But what is left of a civilization that defines life only by its usefulness to the state? What kind of soul survives a childhood, decided by committee? The myth of Sparta begins here, not in battle, but on a slab of stone. The first act of perfection was selection. The first act of civilization, exclusion. And the first sound of Spartan strength was a mother's silence. Those who survived the cliff were not spared. They were claimed. The spared infants grew into instruments of the state, raised under eyes that never looked away. From the first breath to the first command, they learned that every body in Sparta was a resource, every heartbeat an investment. Childhood belonged to the elders, youth to the barracks, and adulthood to the laws of breeding. When the time came to marry, it was not desire that guided them, but duty continuing the cycle that had begun on the mountain. They called it marriage, but it was closer to a bureaucratic experiment. In Sparta, love was never private. It was regulated. The state didn't trust passion. Passion disobeys, so it replaced choice with arithmetic. Desire was measured, lineage recorded, and fertility treated as a military resource. The bed became an instrument of law. You were 20, maybe younger. You'd never chosen a teacher or a friend, and now you wouldn't choose a spouse. In a chamber of elders, men decades older than you studied your ancestry like breeders tracing bloodlines. They compared your father's record in battle to her mother's capacity for childbirth. They balanced family histories like equations, each union designed to optimize strength. The women were judged for symmetry, endurance, the width of their hips. Men were valued for bone structure and reputation. Compatibility meant genetic efficiency. Marriage wasn't about companionship. It was a eugenic calculation written in civic code. When the decision came, you were informed, not invited. The ceremony that followed was ritualized violence. The bride was abducted, her head shaved, her body dressed in men's clothing. When the groom entered later, it was in silence and darkness. There were no vows, no witnesses, just function. The strangeness was deliberate. The state wanted to prevent attachment. Love could compromise obedience. A soldier who adored his wife might hesitate to die. So intimacy was rationed, brief and supervised by ideology. Husbands returned to their barracks before dawn. Wives were left in darkness. If a couple failed to conceive or produced weak children, the state intervened. Partnerships could be reassigned. The strong were paired with the fertile, the barren replaced. A husband could be ordered to share his wife with a proven warrior. Consent was irrelevant. The logic was clinical. Better offspring justified any intrusion. Elsewhere in Greece, adultery was shameful. In Sparta, sanctioned infidelity was patriotic. The body was a public resource. Paternity, a detail. The child once born belonged to Sparta. Even this brutal calculus had admirers. Outsiders saw educated Spartan women, literate, confident, commanding property, and mistook it for liberation. But their education was utilitarian. They learned management to maintain estates, while men were away, trained athletically to strengthen their wombs. Freedom was a form of fitness. Every liberty served reproduction. Imagine her, the bride shaved, stripped of identity, staring into a bronze mirror after the ceremony. She doesn't recognize the face staring back. A soldier's haircut, a stranger's body. Somewhere, she remembers laughter, softness, choice, but memory has no use here. She has become a vessel of state continuity. The men were prisoners too, nights stolen between barracks and brief visits, affection turned into assignment. They were taught to suppress need, to view tenderness as weakness. When they looked at their wives, they saw duty, not personhood. Sparta achieved something no other civilization dared. It nationalized desire. The state didn't just govern the people, it inhabited them, one generation at a time. Love was not outlawed, just redesigned until it no longer resembled love at all. And this was the genius of the system. It made obedience feel inevitable. It wove control into the most private spaces, erasing the boundary between loyalty and intimacy. For centuries it worked. Children were born, trained, weaponized. The machinery kept turning, fed by bodies and belief. But beneath that machinery, something wordless began to die. A people can survive poverty, war, even defeat, but not the slow suffocation of the soul. A civilization that measures reproduction in pedigree and duty eventually forgets what it means to feel. Sparta's bedrooms produced armies, not families. Its marriages produced soldiers, not citizens. The price of perfection was emptiness. Two strangers lying in the dark, performing the act that keeps the machine alive, their hearts long since engineered into silence. The screams of childbirth in Sparta were not met with comfort. They were met with discipline. The women labored under watch, surrounded not by family but by attendants trained to assess. They did not whisper prayers. They issued instructions. Birth was not a personal moment. It was an act of national service. Every Spartan woman grew up knowing her worth, began and ended with her womb. From girlhood, her body was shaped into a state instrument. She ran, wrestled, and trained, not for pleasure, but for pregnancy. The state believed that strong mothers made strong infants. Muscle was patriotism. Endurance was duty. They were fed well, educated, and granted property, but only because it served efficiency. Freedom existed only to perfect fertility. A malnourished mother endangered the army, therefore a nourished one was political. When pregnancy came, her diet and regimen were regulated. Magistrates monitored her like generals overseeing a campaign. Her swelling belly wasn't private, it was public investment. Neighbors watched for signs of weakness. Attendants measured her progress. Even her rest was calculated for output. If labor went well, she was praised for strength. If she faltered, she risked disgrace. A woman who died in childbirth was honored as a soldier dying in battle. Death in service to the state was sacred, whether on the field or in the womb. And when the child was born, the mother did not hold it first. The midwives took the infant away for inspection. Its first cry was not greeted by lullabies, but by the footsteps of the Gerousia, the council of elders who decided if the body was fit for the phalanx. Only if they approved would the child return to her arms. If they did not, she would hear silence. No explanation, no burial, just the absence of a heartbeat she had carried for 9 months. The law demanded she accept it without mourning. To grieve was to confess weakness. Spartan women were expected to suppress tenderness as they suppressed pain. But beneath the discipline, biology whispered rebellion. A woman might stare at her empty arms a moment too long. She might dream of the lost cry she never heard. The state could control the body, but never fully own the soul. Publicly, she performed strength. At festivals, women danced and sang naked before the community, bodies on display for evaluation, an exhibition of vigor, not beauty. The rhythm of the dances was the rhythm of childbirth itself, strength, exposure, endurance. It was a ritualized reminder that even celebration belonged to policy. The ideology worked because it disguised control as pride. Spartan mothers were told they were the foundation of greatness. They were honored as the mothers of warriors, lionesses who birthed lions. They were not oppressed, they were indispensable. But indispensability was just another form of captivity. To the rest of Greece, Spartan women looked liberated, confident, commanding, fearless, yet beneath that poise lay a haunting truth. Their power existed only in service of the state. They owned property, but not their children. They commanded households, but not their bodies. When their sons left for war, they didn't say, "Be careful." They said, "With your shield, or on it." They didn't mean courage. They meant compliance. To return alive, but defeated, was worse than death. The mothers enforced the creed more fiercely than the fathers ever could. It was the ultimate victory of ideology, when those most oppressed became its guardians. For centuries the system held, each birth a transaction, each mother a cog in the great machinery of endurance. But nothing mechanical lasts forever. The cracks began not in the barracks, but in the quiet spaces, the kitchens, the training fields, the places where women remembered what the state demanded they forget. The empire of strength stood on their bodies, but its foundations were built on silence, and silence, like stone, erodes from within. When a Spartan child survived its inspection, it returned to its mother only for a while. She would feed it, harden it, train it to endure cold and hunger. Even affection was rationed. Too much softness could deform the will. Every lullaby was a rehearsal for separation. For in Sparta, children were not raised, they were prepared. At 7, the state reclaimed what it had lent. The mothers who had bled to create them watched in silence as officials arrived at dawn. What left their homes that morning were not sons, but offerings sacrificed to the great forge that would melt them down and recast them as soldiers. The knock came at dawn. No warning, no farewell, just command. The boy was 7, barefoot, clutching a reed mat, and the thin cloak that would be his only protection. His mother didn't cry. She couldn't. She had been trained for this too. One nod, and he was gone, swallowed by the state. The barracks loomed like a fortress carved from discipline. Inside, rows of boys stood in silence. No greetings, no warmth. The instructors moved among them like blacksmiths, testing the metal before the fire. Each child would be hammered until he stopped bending. The agoge, Sparta's education system, wasn't education at all. It was deconstruction. Boys were taught to survive hunger, cold, pain, and humiliation. They received 1 garment per year, slept on beds they built from reeds, and learned that the first lesson of manhood was deprivation. Comfort was corruption. Food was rationed to the edge of starvation. When hunger became unbearable, the instructors ordered them to steal, but never to be caught. Failure meant whipping. The sin wasn't theft, it was incompetence. They were being trained not in ethics, but in efficiency. Morality was irrelevant. Only results mattered. At night, the boys whispered to their stomachs to silence the growling. Sometimes one disappeared, caught stealing, beaten until the instructors stopped counting. His absence was not discussed. One story survived, the boy who hid a fox under his cloak. The animal tore into his stomach, clawing and biting, but he made no sound. When he fell dead, the instructors called it victory. A child had died, proving that pain meant nothing. The older boys, the irons, ruled over the younger with sanctioned cruelty. They dictated punishments, staged humiliations, tested loyalty through torment. Obedience was the only currency. To show emotion was weakness. To hesitate was failure. Language itself became weaponized. Instructors peppered them with questions, riddles, traps. The wrong answer meant pain. The right answer meant survival. Thus was born the Spartan habit of brevity. Speech stripped of waste, meaning sharpened to a blade. A careless word could draw blood. When one instructor bit a boy's thumb for stammering, he was teaching philosophy the Spartan way. Think before you speak, or don't speak at all. Under this regime, trust disintegrated. The barracks were a theater of paranoia. Every friendship could become betrayal. Every smile might conceal an order. A boy learned to sleep with one eye open, and to expect cruelty from those who called him brother. By adolescence, the agoge had remade them. Hunger no longer hurt, wounds no longer registered. They could fight barefoot, march sleepless, endure silence, but endurance came at a cost, the slow erasure of self. There were no lullabies, no memories of home, no private thoughts left untouched by doctrine. The boy's mother became a blurred image, her voice swallowed by discipline. He no longer remembered softness. Yet sometimes, after punishment, lying awake on a mat of reeds, he would feel something flicker. A warmth in his chest he didn't have a word for. It wasn't rebellion, just memory refusing to die completely. Even the state couldn't extinguish the human trace it sought to erase. When they turned 18, the strongest were chosen for the next trial, the cryptia. But by then they were no longer boys. They were instruments sharpened to perfection, bodies of muscle, minds of silence, hearts of ash. The agoge was Sparta's forge. It built warriors who could stand unflinching beneath arrows, who could die smiling under the lash. But a forge cannot shape without destroying. The child who entered was never the same as the soldier who emerged. And that was the point. The state didn't want sons, it wanted weapons. By the time the graduates stood in their ranks, they no longer felt pride or joy, only function. The agoge had succeeded. They were perfect, and therefore already doomed. The moon hung low over Laconia, its light fractured by olive branches. Among the fields something moved, quiet, deliberate. They were not bandits or soldiers. They were boys, fresh graduates, sent into the night with only daggers and silence. Their mission was not war. It was murder. This was the cryptia, Sparta's final rite, the invisible crucible that completed the transformation from youth to weapon. No armor, no banner, no glory. They hid by day, hunted by night. The targets were not foreign enemies, but Sparta's own slaves, the helots. The helots outnumbered Spartans, 10-1. They worked the fields, cooked the meals, built the empire that enslaved them. The ruling class feared them more than any rival army. Fear became policy, and policy became ritual. Each year, Sparta's magistrates declared a legal war on the helots, a bureaucratic spell that turned murder into maintenance. The young killers were ordered to find and eliminate any helot who appeared too strong, too confident, too proud. The goal wasn't extermination, it was control through terror. The state didn't need the helots dead. It needed them afraid. The first kill was always the hardest. A boy crouched in the tall grass, watching a farmer walk home, unarmed, singing to himself. Training whispered in his mind. No hesitation. Hesitation is weakness. The dagger entered the man's back. The song stopped mid-breath. The boy didn't cry out. He just watched the body fall, expressionless, as if performing an assignment. The cryptia didn't test bravery. It tested numbness. Could a boy kill without anger? Could he slaughter a man who posed no threat and feel nothing but purpose? Only then was he truly Spartan. Days blurred into nights of stalking, hiding, listening to his own heartbeat. Hunger and guilt warred within him. The sun became his enemy, the shadows his home. The instructors offered no comfort, no instruction. The cryptia was self-regulated torment. Return alive, and you passed. Fail to return, and you were erased. Meanwhile, in the villages, the helots whispered prayers they no longer believed. At dusk, doors were barred, lamps extinguished, A snapped twig, a rustle in the brush, any sound could mean death. Parents taught children to speak softly, to never stand too tall. Even courage could be fatal. Sometimes, the helots struck back. Legends tell of one who crushed a Spartan youth's skull with a millstone, another who vanished into the mountains to lead fugitive colonies. These acts of rebellion were brief flashes of defiance against an unending night. But for each helot who resisted, 10 more were killed as warnings. By dawn, the killers returned home, transformed, their faces blank, their eyes drained of reflection. They didn't boast of their kills. They didn't have to. Their silence said everything. The elders didn't ask questions. They already knew. The cryptia served 2 purposes. It terrorized the enslaved, and it purged compassion from the free. It was the state's final surgery, removing empathy, cauterizing the soul. After the cryptia, a Spartan could kill anyone, anywhere, without hesitation. This was Sparta's true secret. Not discipline, not valor, but the institutionalization of violence. They had turned murder into citizenship. Every generation renewed the contract with blood, ensuring that cruelty didn't just persist, it evolved. To the outside world, Sparta looked divine, perfect order, perfect warriors, but under that perfection pulsed the quiet heartbeat of horror. The same boys who smiled in formation had once slit throats under the moon, and when those young men marched to war, gleaming, synchronized, unflinching, it wasn't courage that made them unstoppable, it was absence. Absence of fear, absence of guilt, absence of humanity. The cryptia didn't create monsters, it created functionaries, machines built to maintain perfection through terror, and like all machines, they would one day turn their blades inward. For a brief blinding moment, it seemed the experiment had triumphed. Sparta stood unmatched, a city without walls because its warriors were the walls. Other Greek states bent before their discipline. Their phalanxes moved as one, gleaming lines of bronze advancing with mechanical precision. Every spear point, every heartbeat, synchronized. They conquered Athens, subdued revolts and ruled through reputation. The mere whisper of Spartan troops could still an uprising before a sword was drawn. For generations the machine appeared flawless, but machines do not heal. They only function until something breaks. The first fracture was arithmetic. Every fallen soldier was an irreplaceable asset. 30 years of selective breeding, training, indoctrination. Each death thinned the bloodline. The agoge could not manufacture men as fast as war consumed them. Sparta's victories were self-cannibalizing. Each triumph carved out the seed of the next generation. The second fracture came from inside. The state that banned wealth began drowning in it. Gold from conquered Athens and tribute from Persia flooded the city. Austerity, once sacred, gave way to appetite. Property that had once been equally shared consolidated into the hands of the powerful. Poor Spartans, unable to pay for communal meals, were stripped of citizenship. The equals ceased to be equal. Luxury entered quietly, disguised as victory. The communal mess halls emptied. Silk replaced linen. Wine replaced water. Even the women, stewards of estates while men fought abroad, grew rich, owning land, slaves, and influence. Sparta's simplicity, the very core of its myth, rotted beneath the polish of prosperity. Discipline decayed into ritual. The agoge still operated, but its fire dimmed. The lash still fell, but less often from conviction than from nostalgia. Even cruelty, once sacred, became habit. The young recited the old war hymns without understanding their meaning. Perfection had turned into performance, and then came the test that perfection could not pass. Leuctra, 371 BCE, the Thebans, a city once dismissed as provincial, marched under a new kind of leader, Epaminondas, a strategist who saw that symmetry was weakness. He stacked his left flank 50 men deep and drove it like a battering ram into the Spartan right, where the king stood. The Spartans refused to adapt. Doctrine forbade it. They fought as their ancestors had, perfect, predictable, unbending, and were crushed. 400 citizens, nearly 1/3 of their warrior class, died that afternoon. The king fell. The myth of invincibility fell with him. For a people who believed discipline conquered fate, defeat was unthinkable. They returned home to silence. No songs, no speeches, just the awareness that the machine could bleed. The invincible order had finally met chaos and shattered. In the aftermath, the illusion of unity dissolved. Sparta's enslaved helots felt the tremor of weakness. Revolts ignited across the countryside. The state responded with brutality, but it was already bleeding out, demographically, spiritually, economically. The system that had demanded total control now spiraled beyond control. Yet the Spartans clung to ritual like drowning men to driftwood. They repeated the ceremonies of discipline, the dances, the festivals, as though performance could resurrect belief. But even their sacred symbols betrayed them. The red cloaks once dyed in blood faded to brown. The whips that once drew real scars left only bruises. Tourists came to watch the rituals. Romans, Greeks, foreigners paying coins to witness a civilization reenacting its own ghost. The perfection that once terrified the ancient world had become theater. And when perfection becomes performance, decay is irreversible. Sparta's laws still stood. Its streets still bore the rhythm of order, but the pulse beneath had gone cold. The system had turned in on itself, consuming the very virtues it worshipped. Equality devoured by greed, discipline devoured by habit, faith devoured by formality. The machine had reached its apex, shining and silent. Then slowly it began to die, not in battle but in repetition. Leuctra was not just a defeat. It was revelation. The myth cracked open, and something human spilled out. The battlefield reeked of iron and mortality. Bronze shields lay overturned like fallen suns, their polished perfection smeared with blood and dust. For centuries, Sparta had claimed that no Spartan could retreat, no Spartan could fall, but the corpses said otherwise. 400 of their finest, the last generation bred for flawlessness, lay scattered in the Theban dust. When news reached the city, silence spread like contagion. The streets of Sparta, once humming with drills and ritual chants, became still. The women did not wail. Law forbade it, but the air thickened with unspoken grief. Their sons were gone, their lineage cut short. The machinery of perfection had devoured its own architects. Without its soldiers, Sparta's foundation began to collapse. The helots, their enslaved laborers, sensed the shift. For the first time in centuries, the fear moved in the other direction. Whispers became plans, and plans became revolts. Farms burned, overseers vanished. The state, once the embodiment of order, scrambled in chaos, its soldiers too few to suppress the fires it had kindled. Internally, the fractures deepened. The rich clung to estates, built on inherited glory. The poor, stripped of citizenship, watched from the margins. What had once been a brotherhood of equals had turned into a hierarchy of despair. The city that outlawed individuality was now ruled by ego and inheritance. Even the rituals faltered. The agoge continued, but its instructors no longer believed. The sacred festivals of endurance turned into spectacle. Tourists from across Greece, and later from Rome, came to watch the boys whipped at the altar of Artemis Orthia, an echo of old brutality reduced to performance. The crowd laughed, clapped, wagered on which child would faint last. What had once been faith was now theatre. The elders, unable to adapt, turned inward. They quoted the laws of Lycurgus, as if recitation could resurrect the dead. They preached austerity, while dining in private. The younger generation mimicked discipline, but chased pleasure. The whips fell lighter, the speeches grew longer, and the spirit that had once animated the system evaporated. By the time Thebes dismantled Sparta's dominance, the city had already hollowed itself out. When Epaminondas liberated the Helots and founded a new city for them, the Spartan heart broke for good. No army marched to reclaim the lost lands. There were too few to march. The machine that once dictated Greece's fate now struggled to feed itself. And then came the Romans, tourists of empire. They didn't fear Sparta, they studied it. The old rituals were preserved like curiosities in a museum. The whippings, the dances, the slogans, everything once sacred became staged for spectators. The Spartans, once gods of war, became actors playing their ancestors. Their temples stood, but empty. The schools trained no one who mattered. Even the children began to mock the elders' stories of Thermopylae. The The name that once silenced nations now evoked nostalgia, not awe. The collapse was not sudden. It was slow, granular, almost graceful. The city eroded the way, stone erodes, imperceptibly, but inevitably. A cracked shield here, a forgotten law there. The old songs sung more softly each year. The system had no mechanism for rebirth. It could only repeat until repetition meant nothing. By the time Rome ruled the world, Sparta was a tourist attraction, a fossil polished for display. Visitors paid to see the last remnants of perfection. The boys whipped for ceremony, the elders reciting obsolete codes, the city still pretending to believe in itself, and in that pretense lay the final tragedy. Sparta didn't fall in battle, it fell into mimicry. It didn't die from defeat, it died from preservation. The gods they had forged in discipline had abandoned them, and all that remained was ritual echo. The day the gods fell was not the day the king died, it was the day no one noticed the difference between worship and performance. Sparta endures only in echoes. The wind threads through the broken columns of its temples, sighing across a landscape that once trembled beneath soldiers' feet. Grass grows over the parade grounds. The training yards are silent except for cicadas. The bronze gleam has dulled to dust. What remains is the hum of something that ran too long, too hot. A machine that perfected itself into stillness. Visitors arrive with cameras and reverence, murmuring about heroism and strength. They quote Leonidas, gesture toward the hills, and imagine valor, but they're standing inside the bones of an experiment that consumed its own humanity. The legend of the 300 endures because it flatters us. It tells us that perfection is possible if we are only disciplined enough. The ruins tell another story. Perfection kills. Sparta's ideology was not evil in intention. It was logical. Remove weakness, reward obedience, punish failure. It was the clean arithmetic of control, but logic without mercy becomes machinery, and machinery cannot love. The system that once produced invincibility produced extinction. Every perfected generation narrowed the bloodline, reduced flexibility, eliminated change until nothing remained that could adapt. The philosophers who once admired Sparta missed this truth. They praised its order, its equality, its strength, but order without compassion is only petrified fear. Sparta wasn't strong because it lacked weakness. It was strong until it lacked weakness. Without vulnerability, there is no growth, only repetition. Without doubt there is no wisdom, only obedience. Every empire that has followed has borrowed something of Sparta. The cult of efficiency, the fetish of discipline, the worship of productivity. The uniforms change, the slogans modernize, but the dream is the same: to control the messiness of being human, to make life predictable, quantifiable, flawless. Yet the ruins whisper otherwise. They say perfection is entropy. That strength without empathy collapses into cruelty, and cruelty always eats its own future. The earth here has reclaimed what the state sterilized. Flowers bloom where children once trained. Wild vines choke the remains of barracks. The world that Sparta tried to control has returned to its natural disorder, quietly victorious. There is an inscription, half erased, its meaning debated, found near the old altar of Artemis Orthia. Scholars translate it loosely as that which fears imperfection will fear life itself. Whether authentic or imagined, it fits. Sparta's greatest enemy was never Persia, nor Thebes, nor rebellion. It was imperfection, life's only constant. The irony is brutal. The Spartans achieved immortality, just not the kind they wanted. They became a parable, a name invoked by conquerors, coaches, dictators, and dreamers who misunderstand the lesson. They see the discipline, not the emptiness. They imitate the austerity, not the silence that followed. But the truth is carved into the cracks of their stones. You cannot engineer the soul. You can shape muscle, mold behavior, breed endurance. But compassion, curiosity, love, those cannot be legislated or eliminated. They are the flaws that make survival possible. As the sun sets behind Mount Taygetus, light pours over the ruins like molten gold. For a brief moment, the city glows again, beautiful and tragic, as if remembering itself. Then the light fades, and the stones are grey once more, mute witnesses to the cost of perfection. Sparta's warning is not ancient. It's eternal. Whenever a society praises purity over empathy, order over freedom, control over chaos, it walks the same path forward, disciplined, magnificent, until it steps off the cliff it built. Perfection was their god, and gods always demand sacrifice. Sparta offered everything: children, love, mercy, imagination, and in return received nothing but silence. That silence still speaks, if you listen closely enough, not of glory, not of strength, but of the fragile, imperfect heartbeat that outlived them all. If this story stayed with you, keep it close, because the ruins of Sparta aren't just stones, they're warnings. Every time we glorify control, worship perfection, or mistake discipline for meaning, we walk the same road they did, straight into silence. It's not just about ancient wars or vanished empires, it's about us right now building our own machines and calling them progress. So don't just move on, stay curious, share the story, listen to the ruins, because history doesn't repeat itself, it reloads. Subscribe, share, remember, before the next empire mistakes order for eternity,